Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen, do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll move into introductions and get this meeting going. So let me start. All right, so welcome to the Boards and Commissions Roundtable. It's February 25th. Your agenda said 2020, but it is in fact 2021. But it's nice to see you in the new year. And my name is Sophie McGinley. I'm an assistant planner with the City of Eugene Community Planning and Design team. I'm public engagement lead for the Middle Housing Project, and tonight I'm joined by Terry Harding, project manager, and Cody Kleinsmith, Middle Housing intern. So tonight's meeting is scheduled to last 2 hours, and here's a look at our agenda items. Terry and I will provide a project update and context for why we're having tonight's conversation. And after time for questions, we'll have a 5-minute break and then spend the second half of the meeting having a roundtable discussion similar to last meeting's structure. We're also all on Zoom a lot, and it can be really exhausting looking at a screen. So I wanted to begin this meeting with a grounding exercise. This exercise is called box breathing, and I'll guide us through 2 box breaths that align with this handy GIF, and then we can get going. So I started it at the wrong time. I'll let it go back as soon as the breathe in at the top starts. We can get going. We have 4 more seconds till we'll start. Okay, we're gonna breathe in and hold. Breathe out and hold. We'll do it one more time. Breathe in, hold, breathe out, and hold. All right, hopefully we're all centered and ready to go. This slide is a reminder of Zoom housekeeping. I'm sure that you are all well versed in Zoom by now. The major things are to please keep yourself muted while not speaking. Please use the raise hand feature to put yourself in the queue. And it's dinner time, so feel free to eat and throw off your camera, or eat with your camera on, whatever is most comfortable, but just make sure you eat and take care of yourself. We're all humans here. I also wanted to remind you of our shared agreements. So make sure everyone is able to contribute. Hopefully the roundtable structure of this leads to that. Only one person speaks at a time. Respect each other's opinions and perspectives. Be conscious of time. That's a little up to me, but I'll keep you all accountable. And speak from personal experience and the role you serve. And with that, let's get started with a round of introductions. I will close out of this PowerPoint so we can all see each other and put this question in the chat. And I will get started myself. The prompt is introduce yourself and the board or commission you serve on, and share a band or type of music you listen to in your formative years. So I'm Sophie McGinley. As I mentioned, I'm with the City of Eugene, and a band that I listened to in my formative years. It's a lot of the Smiths and Morrissey's solo venture, because I hung out with my dad a lot. And I will pass it to Julia.
All right, wow, my second meeting of the day, and both times I got called on first. Okay, so I'm Julia Boss, and in Eugene, I also serve on the Housing Policy Board, so I'm sort of the liaison for that, and I'm on the Renter Protections Committee of that board. Okay, I'm gonna just date myself right here. I saw Prince live in the Purple Rain tour before most of you were born. So there we go.
Let's throw it to Kelsey.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I was taking your advice, Sophie, and prepping all my snack plates, so I'm ready for this meeting. I'm Kelsey, she, her, hers. I sit on the Sustainability Commission for City of Eugene. And the music that I listen to, I am a 90s baby, so a lot of Michelle Branch.
And let's pass it to Daniel.
Sure. So I'm Dan Lombardi. I serve on the Historic Review Board. And I was thinking a lot about this and trying to think about bands that I didn't want to mention I used to listen to. So probably listed more than those, but I'd have to say Ben Folds and Ben Folds 5 is a pretty formative band for me, and still love anything that Ben Folds does. So.
And how about Ibrahim?
Ibrahim Koulibaly, he, his, him, sit on the Human Rights Commission. The band I listen to, I'll say Nina Simone.
Let's throw it over to Commissioner Isaacson.
Dan Isaacson, Planning Commissioner for the City of Eugene. Frank Sinatra or Bob Dylan for me. When I was at the University of Oregon, EMU Skylight had an impromptu concert with about 24-hour notice that Bob Dylan was coming, and he gave a concert for about 30 people. And because I had a friend of mine who worked in the planning event office, I may or may not have attended that, depending on who I'm talking to. So it was pretty much the best night of my life.
How about Kristen? Kristen is commuting right now, so we can come back. I will put it over to Cody.
Cody Kleinsmith. I'm, as Sophie said, an intern with the planning department, and he, him, his pronouns, and artist. I'm still in my formative years, but I'll go Stevie Wonder.
And let's go over to Terry.
I love this icebreaker. I'm Terry Harding. I am city staff, the project manager for the Middle Housing Code Amendments. And I could list a lot of bands. I was trying to figure out which would be the best. I just lost it. Well, no, I'll go obscure. In the 90s, when I was in college, I worked at a concert venue doing concessions. And so I got to meet a lot of bands because there was a very small backstage kind of area that was connected to the concessions area. So the band that I got to meet at the Santa Barbara Bowl was called Dramarama. And they were a 90s band based out of LA. Definitely formative and a lot of fun.
Kristen, you're just in time to be the last one.
Just arrived at home. So I'm Kristen Taylor. I am on the Eugene Planning Commission, and formative, I'm gonna save my preferential formative years. I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa, so I loved African artists, Salif Keita, Youssou N'Dour, anyways. But I was a huge Smiths fan too. So anyways, yeah.
Sometime when I'm not on the clock, I'll do my impressions for you. All right, let's get into technical stuff and continue with the fun. Sorry, I can never do this very smoothly. Okay. So let's get right to it. I will go through a high-level overview of the state rules, then we'll have time for some questions about those rules, and then Terry will review our approach and what we're calling levels of implementation. Since we last met in the fall, the Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted Oregon Administrative Rules, or OARs, as well as a model code to guide the compliance of House Bill 2001. These rules establish a floor, the minimum we must do to implement the bill. They do things like establish a cap on minimum lot size, parking, and design requirements. They also apply to new build middle housing, as well as conversion of single detached units to middle housing. And they establish siting standards like lot size, density, setbacks, and height. So here are some highlights for what we're working with. As I mentioned, the OARs establish a cap on minimum lot size. So an example of that is for triplexes, the largest minimum lot size we can allow is 5,000 square feet, and for a fourplex, 7,000 square feet. They also cap minimum on-site parking requirements that are generally correlated with lot size, but come out to about 1 spot per unit. Then they establish that design standards can't be stricter than those in the model code or cause unreasonable cost and delay. That's a big theme throughout the OARs. Because of how the standards are written, nothing precludes the city from exceeding minimum standards, which is the basis for how we structured our public engagement and survey. And more on that soon. So a companion to the OARs is the model code. Cities can decide to adopt the entire model code or parts of the model code directly. It meets the OARs and is referenced in the OARs as a sort of ceiling for things like design standards. It also acts as an incentive to comply with the bill, because if we don't, by June 30th, 2022, the model code will automatically apply to the things that we didn't adopt. So here's an example of some standards for duplexes in the model code that shows the difference from the minimum standards established for duplexes in the OARs. So the model code has specific design standards that are the same as those that apply to single dwelling siting and design standards. They allow duplexes to be attached or detached. In the OARs, we can decide whether we want to allow duplexes to be attached or detached. And then with parking in the model code, there's no minimum off-street parking required for duplexes, but in the OARs, we could allow up to 2 spaces or 1 space per unit. So that was very high level, but just wanted to give an introduction to let you all know that we do have rules, and that's the baseline that we're working with, and what we structured our survey based off of. Did anybody have any questions before Terry takes it away with what choices we have and what levels of implementation there are? All right, looks like we can go ahead. So I lied, I'm going to talk a little bit before Terry. So as you know from the last meeting that we held, we began conducting public engagement before knowing what the OARs would look like. We were driving a little blind. So we decided in the meantime, while we were waiting, to ask folks like you about what should guide our implementation of the bill and the technical phase of the bill. We heard from you, the local board or the Boards and Commissions Roundtable, as well as the Local Partners Roundtable, Equity Roundtable, Healthy Democracy Panel, and Student Outreach. And that all formed these guiding values and principles. They were developed by people living in every ward, folks who are part of underrepresented communities, people of all ages, and more, including you all. Your input was critical to developing these, and we ended up with 8, and they are as follows, and I'm always happy to send these out to you separately as well. Equity and access to housing, broad dispersal of middle housing, housing options of all shapes and sizes, compact, efficient housing, sense of belonging, opportunities to build wealth, interconnectedness of housing solutions, and vibrant neighborhoods. We finalized these guiding values and principles right around the time LCDC adopted the OARs. The values and principles called for us to go beyond the minimum, to think creatively and focus on equity. And now Terry will discuss the approach that the guiding values and principles shaped and the levels of implementation we are seeking input on.
Thank you, Sophie. So as Sophie was just saying, we did a ton of outreach over the fall and came up with those guiding values and principles. And above all else, what we heard at all of the groups was that we should consider those minimum standards as a floor. And so that got us thinking, what's the best way to ask, since we just got the rules and we really need to know what sort of approach to take with our implementation of this bill? How can we structure the questions around this idea of how much do we want to do? How many needs can we meet as a city? So we came up with this framework that we're calling levels of implementation. And the levels are allow, encourage, or incentivize broadly. And what that means is described on the slide in shorthand. So the allow level is to simply do what's required by the minimum Oregon administrative rules. And that differs across the housing types, but as a category, that's the allow level of implementation. For the encourage level, we would make choices that would involve removing more code barriers and increasing flexibility to build middle housing. And I'm about to give you an example. And then for the incentivized level, this would take us the farthest in terms of meeting housing needs for more and more people in more and more places by minimizing regulation and applying bonuses such as density bonuses or height bonuses and incentives where we can find a funding source. Next slide. So here's one example. This is in the survey that Sophie talked about being out for everyone to take. And it's the example of a triplex in our R1 zone and how much parking should we allow, or excuse me, how much parking should the city require to be built with that triplex? So in this example, under the allow level of implementation, the city would require 3 on-site, so with the triplex, parking spaces. And that's the maximum that we're allowed to require under the rules. If we wanted to increase that encouragement up to the encourage level, we could do something different with our parking requirements and only require 1 or 2 on the site with the triplex, and maybe allow on-street parking to count towards some of that parking demand for housing that is shared. And then finally, if we chose the incentive path, we could not require any parking for a new triplex on the site with the building. And we could tie that incentive to either a requirement for the units to be affordable or to be located within a certain distance of transit. And those are 2 things that are important community values that we heard in our work doing outreach over the fall and are already embedded in our community vision. So that is an example of one of the questions in the survey. And I think we have some time for questions now. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I will get us out of this PowerPoint so we can see each other. I see Julia has a question.
I have a quick question. If you were to take the model code and put it on the allow, encourage, incentivize, could you tell us roughly where that is?
Yes, that's a great question. I would answer that it is most similar to allow,
Okay.
but there's some caveats to that because the model code functions as a one size fits all. It had to be written to apply to lots of different cities, and they had to be able to just adopt it as is and put it into their code. And honestly, it's written a little bit more towards a city that doesn't have a very big planning department, or like smaller cities that don't have staff or funding to develop their own code. So I know Sophie probably has on the tip of her tongue a difference between allow in the model code and another level of implementation.
There are certain things like the parking example we gave you with the duplex and not requiring any on-site parking for duplexes in the model code. That would probably be closer to encourage or incentivize. But then there are things like design standards that are very close to allow, or it's what allow is based off of in the OARs. So there are times it pushes it a little bit further, but mostly the model code is a model of a code that meets all of the OARs and goes past the OARs in ways that are appropriate.
So maybe allow plus.
Allow plus, that's a great way to put it.
Okay. Got it, thank you.
Yeah, are there any other questions about OARs, model code, how we're looking at implementation and ways to implement? Kelsey.
Not a question, but I just wanted to comment that I really appreciated the structure of the allow, incentivize, and all of that, and that helped me. That helped me a lot in the survey when I took it. So I just want to say, whoever idea that was, that was really helpful. And I was trying to explain the survey actually to a few other people who were trying to take it, and I think that framework was really useful for people to think through this. So I just wanted to comment with that. So thank you.
Thank you. And Ibrahim?
Yeah, I have a question around removing the barriers or giving incentive. Would the city take a look at the fees that comes with building a new structure? Because a lot of people, at least people trying to encourage our people who already have like a single family house and they have enough space and they can build a second or third unit. That is those people may not be able to afford to build a building, also pay all the fees that we have attached to building a new structure.
Great comment. Yes, we're definitely looking at what fees we have the ability to either waive or scale based on the size of the development. In some cases, we might be able to propose, because again, the staff role is to propose things, and then the city council's role is to approve them. We can propose an exemption for middle housing types, and that does exist in our code for certain things already. So there's precedent for doing that, and we're still taking suggestions for ways to incentivize. One thing that we're in the process of adding to our list of meetings and outreach groups is a developer focus group. And so learning from market rate and affordable housing developers, what would make the difference for them or make a certain kind of housing project more financially feasible is something that we're in the midst of scheduling.
Are there any other questions or comments? Kelsey, did you raise your hand again, or is it just up? Okay. All right. Well, I have on our agenda to take a 5-minute break now, but we are cruising. Is there support for just moving ahead and delaying the break? I see a show of like thumbs up, thumbs down. All right, we are cruising. Let's go ahead. So now we're going to move into the roundtable discussion component of this roundtable, and I will share my screen again. Thank you all for being so honest tonight. We're not going to do this, but we're going to do this. So now we'll have a roundtable discussion that is structured to hear from everyone. And what we're hoping to hear tonight is, in your opinion, which levels of implementation best meet the 3 components of the triple bottom line or TBL framework. I sent out an attachment with more information about the TBL. It's a framework that's been used by City Council to assess and guide how we make decisions based off of social equity, environmental, and economic factors. So we're going to, one at a time, start or go through each of the components of the TBL framework, and we're going to start with social equity. The question is, which implementation option, allow, encourage, or incentivize, best promotes social equity? And do your answers differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? We'll have about 2 minutes per person for each of the 3 questions, although we shaved off a lot of time before, so we could probably bump it to a whopping 3 minutes. And I will exit out of this so we can see everyone and put the question in the chat. And that'll take just a moment because I'm not very adept at this. Let me go through, and I can just call on folks. And if you'd like more time or to defer, let me know. This is a pretty casual space. So again, that first question is, which implementation option, I should probably put the topic, this is social equity, which implementation option best promotes social equity, allow, encourage, or incentivize? And let's have I called on Julia first last time. It's just because you're up in my left-hand corner. Let's have Kristen go.
Oh, sorry, I'm not muted. Wow, I like to actually commingle them. It's good you isolate it because I always commingle it to anyways. So parking, I would say actually all three of them, I would, in terms of social equity, I'd probably simply put them all in incentivize. Allow more flexibility, both in parking, reduce numbers. So I go into the incentivize level. Is that kind of what you want? Or sorry, I'm thinking about more in terms of your graph of
Yes.
allow. Okay, so you want that kind of more literal. Yes, then I would say incentivize all three.
Great, thank you. And I should add, so some projects have what's called a triple bottom line sounding board, and they use that feedback to take to council when we do have our staff presentation. And it's usually comprised of folks on boards and commissions. So this was just a really nice opportunity to combine the both. And that's why we're asking you this. And we're looking at what choices or what recommendations can staff make that best align with city goals and values. And why we're using the TBL framework. And I'll go to Julia now.
Can you put that graph up, those recommendations up? That would be great.
Absolutely. Put that up real quick.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, so I would say on everything except parking, I would go wholly on incentivize because it makes it cheaper to build. On parking, I think if you want to achieve social equity, you would have to recognize that families and people with disabilities may be less able to live in a facility where there is not on-site parking. So there might need to be some kind of recognition that parking could be a factor or could be treated differently specifically for those reasons. It's a lot easier to live in a building that has parking on the street if you're abled, if you're a young person, and you're able to easily take public transportation. So, but otherwise, yes, I would definitely. I mean, and there that would be sort of, gee, maybe parking might be encouraged, but everything else would be incentivized.
Thank you. I'm taking notes. So if there's this delay of me silently looking down, that is why. Let's ask Kelsey.
Yeah, Julia actually said exactly what I was going to say. That ideally I would say incentivize all the way across the board, but I completely agree that I think when it comes to parking, encouraging might be, in terms of social equity, might make the most sense. And I had the same exact thought process that whether it's families or people with mobility challenges, that I think it's one of those things where at a certain point, unless the transportation infrastructure is being kind of like upgraded or provided at the same pace of housing, it could potentially be unfair in some ways to be providing the housing and then just expecting people to be car free if the surrounding infrastructure doesn't necessarily provide for that. So I would probably also put encourage, or I would definitely put encourage for parking, but incentivize for everything else.
Thank you. How about Daniel Lombardi?
Pretty much agree with what most folks would say. I just want to add one other piece to and I would say that leaning towards encourage for parking. Everything that has been said, I agree with. And I think also thinking about folks who need vehicles to travel outside of the Eugene area for work, right? And so I think that is a social equity thing, is that people do sometimes need to travel outside of transit zones to get to work. And so having at least access to a vehicle and knowing that there's a place that they can park it every night. I think sometimes when you're just saying, hey, this is a place where there's only street parking, that can become sort of Wild West, finding a place to have your car every night and feeling you can get to it and get to work on time. So I would like to see that be encouraged. I mean, I think with lot coverage, I'm also kind of leaning towards encourage, and I think only from the standpoint of people, want to feel like they're becoming, maybe not sharing as many walls as they've always shared as they move through their housing process. And someone who has been a renter before and moved into my own home, that's a huge thing. It's a huge step forward. And so thinking about how close places are to each other, allowing people to feel that independence. So I think at the end of the day, I'm sort of like a hard encourage for parking, as sort of towing the line, encourage, incentivize for lot coverage, and then incentivize for design standards.
Thank you. How about Ibrahim?
Yeah, I want to echo the parking aspect. The street I live in, actually they are building around 25 to 30 units, duplexes. We already have parking problem on the street, and it is sometimes the source of a lot of community conflict, disagreement, people going after each other, and parking is all, even the parking size. Some duplexes have parking. You cannot park a car in the parking garage. It's unless you have like a Prius, you cannot park any other car because it's so small. So parking is, to me, is the most important.
Thank you. And Kristen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I realized since I was starting, I was time efficient. While I agree with parking just because of my day job, so changing my hat, I work with often the developers, and what's interesting is parking's complicated because it also has some inherent inequities. Because parking ends up being being very careful and thoughtful about how parking is addressed. So that's why my preference was incentivized, because I think that one, TDMs, which I know is currently transportation demand management programs, which is currently a topic that is also being processed. That being careful about how it's looked at. So by decreasing parking on site can decrease cost, quite frankly, in a substantial way. Now, do developers choose that? Not necessarily, because they wanted viable development, right? You also not only have multifamily, but you have duplex. So I was actually thinking about that as well. So let's say I am lower income and I create a situation where I can share the cost of a property and split the cost of building a duplex. And I'm right next to a transportation corridor. And maybe I don't want to have parking because of the fact that I want to add ADUs and I want to rent them, or basically, I want to kind of think out of the box a bit and recognize parking is always very complicated. So I think it inherently has inequities to actually require. I also think there's inequities like Ibrahim brings up and the others, that by not requiring it has challenges. One, ADA has to be met, period. You actually have to provide ADA parking for developments, even though by land use code, it wouldn't be required. By ADA code, it's required. So know that there are other requirements. Now, family, that doesn't address it. So I would think if we're going to incentivize and add, so encourage, maybe because of the flexibility, if we're going to incentivize, that's a tool where we could potentially get at the issues of inequities and where it occurs. So there. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Dan Isaacson next.
I think parking is probably the most important. I mean, I'm biased. I spent most of my graduate in Chicago, so parking is a hot commodity there. But we would hear that more than we would hear the need for development, even though housing costs and prices there are exorbitant as well. And that if you have a house and you've been lucky enough to get one, or if whether you're renting or own yourself, the fear that parking on the street is going to incur fines, which you can't pay, your car's going to be towed. Now I can't get to my job. Now I'm going to lose my house. Just becomes this unwanted passenger in your life. And it's something that a lot of people that I'm friends with, and myself included, don't think of as much anymore, or don't, because I'm just not at that economic status anymore. But a lot of my friends still do, and a lot of people in our community do. So I think that is something that if we address it from that perspective, then it begins to be more paramount. So I would say incentivize parking most, and the rest kind of a quasi between incentivize and everything else, like Kirsten was talking about.
Thank you. I think I got all voices in the room, and I'm generally hearing, and I'll of course send you notes after the fact. Oh yes, Julia, go ahead.
Well, yeah, so I sent a sort of incoherent message in the chat, but has Eugene ever considered the possibility of an on-street resident permit parking structure? Because some of the issues could be resolved with that really readily, as they are in other cities, where a lot of the tensions arise in Eugene right now on parking because a longtime resident sees a car on the street and is upset, and they imagine it to be abandoned, and they phone, and then the car gets ticketed or towed, and it's unpleasant. But if they knew that that car belonged to a neighbor and it had a sticker in the window that said, this is a Zone 8 resident, that could diffuse some of the tension. And usually you can do it with a fairly nominal fee. It might be a kind of a halfway point. So at least in terms of what Dan was mentioning.
Thank you for the suggestion, Julia. We do have some parts of the city that have existing parking permit programs near the university primarily.
Right.
And so there have been requests to expand that beyond, for example, around multifamily development assisted living development at Cascade Manor has been asking about a permit program, and apartment developments in other parts of the city. So I appreciate the suggestion. I think that is an example of a tool that as Eugene grows and infills, we can look at what makes sense in what areas, what parts of town. The difficulty with expanding it right now to different places is the cost of deploying parking monitoring staff outside of kind of the downtown core. That's where we are now, at least.
Okay, thank you.
So I heard there will always be robust conversation around parking. And then I heard lot coverage mentioned. Does anybody have any opinions or thoughts around design standards and the connection to allow, encourage, incentivize? The three things we're really focusing on are the ones that are focused on in the survey, which if you haven't taken it, please do. It's open till next Friday, the 5th. But we're focusing on parking, lot coverage, and design standards. Julia, go ahead.
Well, here I'm thinking that obviously the primary focus would be incentivized by not having horribly stringent design standards, because that means that the building is cheaper. But if you're thinking of equity from a more subjective perspective, including whether people in the new neighborhood will be welcomed by their neighbors, there might be ways to incentivize that via template designs instead of, so if you're choosing between, are we going to have a super lax design standard structure, or are we going to say, you can get around our encouraged level design standards by using an existing template that's been pre-approved by the city? That might be a way to achieve a goal that would tend toward cheap, but also perhaps make people feel more welcome when they move into those neighborhoods. So it's a tension. I mean, I can obviously see the value of don't push it because you don't want to make the buildings more expensive, but then there might be some way to recognize that there will be neighborhood opposition if there are no design standards. So.
Thank you. Any other comments before we move on to, oh, Kristen, go ahead.
Just trying to unraise my hand now. So one, I live in one of those neighborhoods that has a parking, I'm in a parking area zone. It actually is, honestly, I would have a caveat, a warning. There's some inherent, I mean, we all know, I've been spending a lot of time at work and in another board that I'm involved in terms of anti-racism and anti-discrimination and kind of looking at bias. Planning is a profession, and architecture, design, that has inherent conscious and unconscious bias, and actually inherent, riddled full of discrimination and racism, actually systemic. So I'm really cognizant right now and spending a lot of time, and we're actually looking into the details, the history and current. Those parking permits are, it's basically public right of way, and it is an exclusionary, it costs money. So if we're going to use that as a tool, I think it should be free for some. I think cost is going to be something that really needs to be looked at. So with that said, I think it serves as a tool for the University of Oregon in terms of it's really trying to prevent students from coming into the using the neighborhood as a parking lot. But I'd be careful about how it's used in other neighborhoods. I also think Dan's comment is really great. We are in an interesting place in time, Eugene. We are obviously not Chicago, not where I come from, which is the San Francisco Bay Area. We are in many ways quite suburban. And trying, you know, there's parts of Eugene that look very urban that have very different issues than suburbia. So that's why I think it's important to recognize that where we are in terms of the process. So I do agree with the rest of the group. Parking is, it's interesting from an environmental perspective. It's also interesting from a cost perspective. It also has impacts in terms of neighbors, transportation system, blah, blah, blah. So it's I think a big, important topic. Design standards, I am really hesitant to have templates that are approved okay designs from the community standpoint. I think typically, Eugene doesn't really have design standards. We have some design standards for form-based code in the Walnut Mixed Use Station. We use it as a tool, but I'd be careful how we're using it. Why are we using it? And does it have embedded discrimination? Does it have embedded bias? Does it have embedded kind of, because design is quite subjective. So what somebody views as beautiful, somebody else might not. So figure out from a planning perspective and what we're regulating, what really are we regulating? So I tend to be more on the side of deregulate and look at your critical issues. What are the critical issues that we're trying as an overall community to try to establish? You know, you look at Santa Fe, it's got high design standards. How many people that are looking for affordable housing can afford to live in Santa Fe? I mean, that's an extreme example. That's got pretty significant design standards. So I guess you know, you can tell from an affordable housing perspective, I have a pretty strong opinion in terms of design standards. I also think there's embedded racism and discrimination.
Thank you, Kristen. And Daniel Lombardi.
Yeah, I just wanted to back up what Kristen is saying. And, you know, I think even as the representative of the Historic Review Board, you know, I have some ideas about character of community and what that means for Eugene, and you know, maintaining a certain aspect of history, which is also problematic. For, you know, if we dig into it deep enough. And so I think when I think about design standards, you know, I would like to shy away from like what it looks like, but more about how quality is it, right? You know, I think that just because you can't afford to buy a home, or you're sort of maybe trying to find a starter place to build some some capital, you shouldn't have to move into a crappy place to do that. And so that's where I would like to see the design standards sort of head, is like, we're not just throwing up things that are going to last for 10 years, 20 years, and then have to be knocked down and rebuilt. I think that's what I worry about from that perspective. What it looks like, again, it's subjective. I think that's in the eye of the beholder, and we're going to get pushback on that from community members who have been here forever, and people who are going to have it next to their homes. And I think it's just recognizing that people are moving here. We got to get some structures up, and we need to worry less about what they look like and more about, are they usable by the people that are going to move into them.
If I could just clarify. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Julia.
Oh, I just want to clarify my point about design standards. I was thinking more in the sense of, I was opposing the idea of there being complex design standards that someone had to meet. And I was thinking of the templates more in the way that they're being proposed for use in relation to ADUs, where they would save someone the cost of having to have a building designed. So that was, I was thinking of templates more in the sense of, we're not going to require you to meet all of these complicated and difficult design standards, but if you're looking for a way to not have to pay an architect $10,000 to, custom design a unit for you, here's an option. So sorry, I just wanted to clarify that, because I don't actually have strong what it should look like opinions on that. And I think that Dan and Kristen both made good points on that.
Thank you. And then I have Dan Isaacson, followed by Kelsey.
Yeah, I mean, there's the old saying that, you show me your budget and I'll show you your values, right? So the same thing kind of, I think, applies across the board to the code as well. If we start with what our values are and apply that to how we want what we're working on here to be reflective of the community as a whole, then that's the foundation we're starting from, versus the opposite, which way is let's put together our policies and then apply what our values are to them and hope that they mesh up. I mean, to a certain degree, we can have that conversation early. I mean, I have my own personal views, and they may differ from other people here and throughout the community, but I think everyone is entitled to a safe, affordable place to live, where they don't have to fear that their property or possessions, whether inside their house or outside on the parking lot, are not going to be there the next day, or that they have to compromise the place that they live so they can have that other thing. It doesn't have to be a catch-22 or either or, so they can have a chance at the quote-unquote American dream, and that it should be universal across the spectrum. So again, if we start from what are our values and then build from there into what we want the code to look like, I think that's the best approach.
Thank you. And Kelsey, and I'll have Kelsey be our last speaker this go around. And you can always follow up with us if you have more to say. We'd love to hear from you. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in really quick on the idea of like the permit parking, because initially I was like, oh yeah, that's something that like could be could be a way forward, but something I wanted to throw out too, that I've noticed I live in Jefferson West Side, and I also see the potential risk with permit parking for on street also becoming like an anti-homelessness measure or an anti car camping measure. And I say that given I've just witnessed in our own neighborhood there has been an influx in car kind of camping on this street, like after the wildfires, just because there are certainly people that are grappling with that as an issue. And so something moving forward, if the permit parking piece is considered, I just wouldn't want to see that become like a mechanism to kind of preclude people who are in that position to be getting into additional trouble because they don't have a permit. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to move forward. This is kind of a funky exercise because it's 3 of the exact same questions, just with a different lens. And so this time, throw it up so that it's nice to visualize, but I won't try to do anything fancy with it. This one now, we're going to be talking about environmental health. And again, I will put it in the chat so that we can all see it. And it's asking which implementation option encourage, incentivized, best promotes environmental health. And do your answers differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? And I'll have everybody speak once, and then we can have a little bit more time for discussion after that. Stop sharing and put this in the chat. I'll get better at this by the end of the meeting. And let's start with Dan Isaacson.
I think incentivizing is great. My feeling about it just in general has always been that the further up the socioeconomic ladder you go, the more options you have across the board on everything, which includes being more environmentally friendly. I mean, if you are working 60 hours a week at minimum wage to be able to afford your $1,400 a month rent, because that's the only thing you can find, then you have to have your car. You know, you would love to be able to take the bus and ride your bike and all that stuff. That's really great. But the reality of the cards that are on the table are what you have to play your hand with. And so it dovetails into what we were talking about earlier, in that environmental is a concern, and we all share it. I know I do. But at the end of the day, I want people to be able to have a roof over their head. And if it's a choice between an extra parking space and giving them the option of folks the option of having that, that's where I'm on.
Thank you. And I'll go over to Kelsey.
Thanks. Yeah, I would probably just echo that. I was really trying to like rack my brain through the nuance of this question. And I think I would say honestly what I would replicate kind of my answer from the last time. I think if we I think if we were thinking through some of these issues in a vacuum and we got to say like we are just focused on the environment, then like I would probably say incentivize all the way across. But fundamentally, like humans are part of the environment, and like our relationship to the environment is all related. And so again, to me, it's like, yeah, we could do things that are quote unquote good for the environment, but if it's still leading to people not being able to access housing, being housing insecure, I would still argue that that is not meeting our goals. So I would, yeah, I think I would just replicate my answers for the first one for this one as well.
Thank you. Let's go over to Ibrahim.
I would say that incentivizing things like environmental friendly material, like energy efficient windows, solar panel, those kind of things. Giving either tax credit or a break on people on those materials may help people to build more environmental friendly units, and also encourage the city to probably expand public transportation to offset a little bit the need for parking, for driving, reduce the carbon footprint, and all those kind of things.
Thank you. Hop over to Dan Lombardi.
Yeah, so, I think with parking, I'm still sort of in the encourage phase. I mean, I think we still need to, these are, again, as Kelsey said, these are not sort of happening in a vacuum, right? I think we need to think about them holistically. And so I think social equity comes right into this conversation. And, I think from the lot size perspective or the lot coverage perspective, I think just because you're, you get sort of deemed in that lower income world doesn't mean that you shouldn't have access to green space, right? And so I think we need to be thinking about that from that perspective of encouraging that. And so that, again, it sort of fills that equity lens, but it also fills that lens of, those people can grow some food in their yard, and they can have access to some space that they can go outside and breathe fresh air, right? And that they're not all on top of each other. And I think it's what I worry about when we think about this is the density piece is, it's packing people in. Again, we're sort of still in this this sort of suburban feel environment, which I think, Kristen, you brought that up earlier, that we can maintain that for a little bit and still build in a way that allows for some of that green space to continue to exist in all of our neighborhoods as we grow.
Thank you. Let's go over to Kristen.
I actually think what Dan said is brilliant. in terms of going back to our values. So I love the idea of incentivizing. Now, I think we need to be thoughtful, is that if there's a checklist of values for various incentives, that there's so we have a code, whether it's minimum, maximum. So we have our bumper guards is the code, clear and objective standards. And then we have incentivize, and we look at what are our community values, not in isolation. So if the checklist actually was a TBL, includes Envision Eugene, and sometimes it somehow is packaged in a way that when you get incentives to do something, you're actually achieving these things that are consistent with our community. So I am been very involved and actually founded our branch of the U.S. Green Building Council in Eugene. And I remember our first speaker that we had, keynote speakers, and it was packed. We had 150 people, not just architects, not just designers, but it was and basically that said, how many Eugenians think that we are very sustainably minded? I think everybody raised their hand. And the speaker, not from Oregon, said, how many of you actually act on it? Does Eugene act on it? I would say not even 10% of the room. So it's an opportunity for us to actually incentivize, and it's a bigger issue, right? So if we incentivize by allowing less parking, well, hopefully there's a bus system and you don't create environmental justice issues. If there's incentivize to not have lot coverage, then are there parks? You go back to that density. So I think we've got to take a look at what the larger infrastructure and design is doing to support some of the direction we're going. And we're at a really good place, like the other Dan said, is that, if we're kind of fringe, suburbia, urban, we can actually take up space and create public placemaking or some kind of eco districts, where you start to look at design more comprehensively or holistically, where you have shared parking, you have a shared open space. So I think that's why we're in an opportunity. I know House Bill 2001 doesn't afford us, where I'm thinking bigger than that, is that we can do these things right now. We're not so dense that we're in Chicago and we're unraveling things. The last thing I want to say is I love Oregon's UGBs. I mean, it does create challenges in terms of affordable housing, but environmental, I actually think it's beautiful. So if you're going to get true green space, true viable habitat, it can happen. I mean, we've got farm, ag, open space, public space, parks. So I would just take a look at parks. It doesn't mean that I'm saying don't have any, but I like the idea of keeping density and maximizing our UGB rather than expanding it. So I think you, Sophie, or Terry's group had a comparison of the urban forest between Portland and Eugene. And even though there's more coverage in Portland, they have a bigger urban forest. So I think we just have to be smart about where our urban forest is. The islands, the landscape islands, our public portions. Anyways, so big answer to.
Thank you. And lastly, I have Julia. Looks like you're muted.
Sorry, I'm just having computer issues this evening. Sorry about that. Okay, so I missed the question, but I'm assuming we're going basically over parking, coverage, and design in relation to sustainability. Is that where we are right now?
You're exactly right.
Okay, so as a resident of a townhouse community that actually has designated very large community space, my perspective on this is incentivize, incentivize building that encourages shared walls, because that is cheaper to build. It allows more green space within the same lot coverage, and it is more environmentally sustainable. So if you have a design that puts a little bit of energy into soundproofing between units, but doesn't make every single structure have, windows looking out in 4 directions, you save a ton of money. You can put more, property on one space, more, living space on one lot, and you can contribute toward that sense of preserving green space. So I think anything that, when we talk about the triple bottom line, anything that results in a structure that is simultaneously more sustainable and cheaper helps make it possible for the person who has less money to live in that unit at the end. So that's my sustainability piece.
Thank you. And Kristen.
Thanks. I just wanted to add to that I meant to say this, is that with incentivize, going back to the values, is sometimes, when you have a developer, you've got your first costs, right? And if there's a way to incentivize, Ibrahim said it's the exact same thing. To have a green building is actually not, it's more of a tried and true. A lot of the products have been tried and true, and the alternative kind of design details are there. So it actually doesn't cost more to build more sustainable buildings. Now, obviously there's some bells and whistles and you can have some higher technology, but bottom line, it really doesn't. So incentivizing, kind of, once again, true to our values, incentivizing green building, we can be a better player in reducing carbon footprint by basically saying, yeah, we believe in this, not only for our community, but the world. So I love it. And it's not just materials, it's design. Like, I just forgot her name, sorry about that just spoke, developers are not shrewd. They want success. So giving them tools to be successful, and if the desire that people want to have sustainable, they want more open space, they want sustainable, they want more green, non-toxic materials, they're going to deliver it if it can be affordable. So we can play a role at the planning level to help facilitate that by incentivizing.
Thank you, Kristen. And Dan Isaacson.
And just kind of go off of what Kristen was saying a little bit earlier. I mean, you're right. I mean, Chicago, it's, if you want something new, you have to take something away. It's always a balance on either side of the equation. And I always go back to this, and I've said it a number of different times. So if you've heard me say it, forgive me. But Paris has the same land density and square mileage of Eugene, exactly, almost to the number, and it had 10 times the population. So if they can put 2.5 million people in the same 40 square miles, we sure as hell should be able to do 250,000 or 300,000 in Eugene without the amount of complexity that gets kind of leaped onto this all the time. We can find ways to put higher density buildings. We can find ways to put more cars on the road without there being the environmental damages. I mean, Paris is one, and not a utopia by any means, but they are definitely leading the charge on environmental concerns and solves. So there are solutions out there if we have the values and if we have the desire to meet them.
Thank you. I've used that fact since the last roundtable, too many times. So thank you for that again. Do we have any other comments? We are cruising through and might have an early meeting. We only have one more question for you all. All right, let's do it. So our last question is the exact same, but we are focusing on economic prosperity. So I will share it real quick. So on economic prosperity, which implementation option allow, encourage, incentivize best promotes economic prosperity? Do your answers differ across the topics of parking, lot coverage, and design standards? And I will put this in the chat and randomly call on you all again. Let's get started. Get started with Ibrahim this time.
I wasn't prepared for that one, but
Would you like to defer?
yeah, you got me.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Let's get started with Dan Lombardi.
Sure. I think I'll be pretty quick on this one, but again, I think again that equity lens still gets thrown on here every time I think about this, and I think the parking piece still, I'm sort of in the encourage phase of I think we can't just say no ability or create a barrier for someone who has a vehicle to sort of say, well, I can't, that's not a place that I can live, even if it's affordable, right? So I think there's a transition phase here where we're going to be hopefully moving away from fossil fuels and starting to see people using cars less, but that's not a reality that's around the corner, but the people coming is, and so we have to be ready to give them places to live. And so I think that pushes me more towards incentivize when it comes to lot coverage and sorry, the other piece of that, which is just lost it, but the other piece, design standards, that's right. And so just thinking about affordability and the ability for folks who are trying to build wealth, like people who have been able to do, and I think Dan has already brought this up, of some of us have moved into that phase where we're not having to build that wealth, we're building it in different ways, being homeowners or whatever. We have to be able to allow for that. And so I think making it affordable, but also recognizing these pieces of, we don't want to build something that is not built to last, right? And so that's a big piece that's important to me when it comes to the design standards of cheap, not meaning cheaply built, right? But cheap to affordable, but quality. So.
Thank you. Let's go over to Julia.
Yes, so I don't think I have anything especially innovative to say here. I mean, economic prosperity, obviously, we still live in a world where your route to prosperity, i.e. your route to your job, may be a car. So there has to be, in that encouraged level where there is some parking. Lot coverage, I mean, there I would say for lot coverage and design, I would pretty much just echo what Dan Lombardi said, that we should encourage a lot coverage solutions that tend toward allowing more people to rent or buy more cheaply. And whatever is pushed on design is not about conforming aesthetically as much as it is about encouraging or incentivizing long-term, for smart thinking about buildings that will not fall down, or that make sense for homeowners or renters in the long term, for example, by being more environmentally sound so that they will be cheaper to heat, shared walls, or more requirements on insulation or windows make more sense than something that says you have to have X number of gables. That's what we want to avoid, is something that becomes an aesthetic standard. So that, yeah, I would go with what Dan said.
Thank you. How about Kristen?
I love this conversation. It's so complex, actually. I think what helps me, that I have not been clear, is I think there's a really big distinction between those that are building for others and those that are building for themselves. So that's where I get really uncomfortable. So if you've got a multifamily development, which I actually think, okay, our multifamily standards can be kind of looked at and addressed a little bit, because it actually produces pretty much one outcome. I mean, I'm not even oversimplifying it. So it needs some work. Yet the objectives within it are still a lot of what we'd be talking tonight about: open space, shared. I mean, it's it's got some design standards, but it's not micromanaging it. It's really thinking about what are the critical pieces of something very dense on a site. But then you go to this, just a story, a first-time home buyer, they're going to buy a parcel, they're going to put a duplex on it. I really don't want standards of durability, but that's actually right there. We've got discrimination right there. You've got kind of classism to some degree. It's like, you know, they might not be able to afford whatever standards of durability. And that also is a tool that a neighbor that, like in my neighborhood, doesn't want their neighbor. That, sorry, you can't actually build a house that actually is meeting the design standards, the durability, whatever those design, so you actually can't be in our neighborhood. So that makes me very uncomfortable. And the question of parking is an interesting one, because currently economically, there are very few multifamily housing that will provide no parking, because their housing development becomes unrentable to some degree. So more what becomes a concern is, are they going to up the rent because people that want parking are going to pay for it? So parking, once again, that's like a separate, much more complicated. So what I like is, I'd love to not see hard and fast minimums or maximums in some of these critical areas. So if you were to say you have to, because what I find with a lot of my clients is there's a clear minimum and there's a clear maximum, and some want to go over the maximum. So I'd be looking at, okay, our maximums are pretty good, honestly. And I more find it in retail, but in terms of residential, those minimums is just kind of dissecting how do we want to be creative, and once again going back to values, and what are those consequences both for somebody that's purchasing trying to come into the market, or those that are developing for others. Those are developers that can actually afford to do a larger development. I think we've got to tether them apart, and I think it's viable. 3 or more units, where multifamily standards serve a purpose. Whereas some of that imposition on someone that's just starting out, and the only way they can afford to purchase a property and develop a structure is to put a triplex, because they're going to rent the other 2 units, I'd be more hesitant. So the last thing I want to say is, the City Club just had a speaker that talked about maybe one of our biggest issues, and that is parcel ownership. And is there a way we can pay attention to how lots are split up? Can there be, what can we do? Now, a lot of it's banking. There are entities and disciplines outside that are connected to kind of parts of the process of development, but not necessarily planning or development code. It's hard to purchase. Maybe you can't afford to purchase the parcel and develop, but maybe you could buy a tiny home, start on a larger co-housing single lot. So is there anything we can do to incentivize something that's outside of our discipline? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And you'll like our next steps probably when we go into that. And lastly, I have Ibrahim.
Yeah, thank you. I think Kristen was speaking for me, actually. I am in exactly that situation. My house is located in Santa Clara area. I have half an acre, and I'm dying to be able to add few structures on the back, because one, I don't like yard work, so I think that's going to take care of that. But the process, the cost is too much for me. And I know a lot of people, if we want to preserve the rural land, meaning that we're not going to develop outside of the urban growth boundary, you have to count on people who are, some of them are already struggling to meet their mortgage right now, but may come with some type of financing to build a second structure that may help them to not only increase the value of the asset, but also kind of provide little income to go toward their expenses. And that group seemed to be left out because the cost is the number one obstacle for that thing. Second is, what we may see is developers preying on single family homes, knowing that if you have the right lot size, they may offer you more and more for you to sell your house and move somewhere else so they can develop triplex or quadruplexes. And that will also limit the access to home ownership. The duplex of the complex I'm talking about next to me, when they built the first one, the guy came to me and asked me if I wanted to buy. I was interested. He wanted to sell it for $525. I did not know that time that they were building 8 more duplexes and 6 more triplexes in the same area. But today, all of them, they are not built yet, but they are sold. And they went for almost $800,000 for a duplex. Not need to say that the rent will increase. The rent over there, I don't know how much people are gonna pay, but the person who's going to buy those duplexes is not going to bring money from somewhere else to subsidize for the mortgage. So I think thinking about how to make it easier on first-time home buyers or somebody like myself who have 2, 3 properties, to be able to build something at a low cost for therefore for the rent will be more affordable is the way to go, instead of thinking that developers will come and build parkings and parkings are needed. But the reality is there is, unless the city build areas, and that's maybe something the city may consider, where neighbors can park their car and walk home, and those kind of structure where you have huge parking businesses like we have in downtown, start building that around some neighborhood. It's going to only put more pressure on building that's even one of the reasons why some people did not want with CDBG when we were talking about the obstacle of building low-income housing. It's part of it is people don't want to see parking war in their neighborhood, people trying to park a car. And I live in big cities. I live in New York, I live in Paris. You can drive around for 45 minutes to an hour and a half. You can't find a parking. And you go further, and finally you walk 2 miles home. So I think it is important that we find measures to make it affordable for people who have one house and they have enough space to be able to build a second one. And I think Kristen said all of this more eloquently than I could ever say.
Thank you, Ibrahim. So in the queue, I have Dan, Isaacson, Kelsey, and then Kristen.
I also want to echo what Commissioner Taylor said. I think that it was spot on. I will say the first house I bought in Chicago was because there was the first time homebuyer tax credit that came about from the implosion of the housing market in 2009. And I bought a rundown duplex in a very bad part of town, built it up by hand. I learned more about floor joists and mortar than I'll ever want to know my rest of my life. But I rented out the other spot. It was a very small duplex, but it afforded me the ability to, have a supplemental income during a time when I had just graduated college, and they were not hiring people with my degree or my age group. It was not happening. So it was a pathway out. And I benefited from a whole lot of luck, a whole lot of privilege, and a whole lot of savings. But for most people, the house that they purchase is their biggest investment they will ever own. And if we're giving them the opportunity to have a single family home and they can pay it off over 30 years, and there's whatever that amount is, but then we also have the ability for them to add on an EDU and have supplemental income, what pathway trajectory does that change their life? And how much do we do that over community-wide and a city-wide and a county-wide and a statewide and national-wide by incentivizing people to build up their communities, invite more people in, have more inclusion, be exposed to more cultures and ideas? I don't see how this hurts us on any level, frankly, but that's just me.
Thank you. I have Kelsey and Kristen.
Yeah, thanks. I haven't gone yet, so I have a few things. The first would be, let me put my hand down. First and foremost, I would mostly defer on this, like, I don't feel super qualified to talk like the hardcore economics of all this, just professionally from like my background and what I do. So I'll defer to everyone else's expertise, who everyone I feel like has shared a lot of really good content, and I'm learning a lot. So that would be the first thing. But so instead, I'm going to kind of use my time to just share a few other comments, which is that I am a renter. I am also like in the younger demographic. I don't own property, and frankly, I don't know a lot of people in my age demographic who are en route to owning property, just the way things are kind of going. And so that being said, I think when you first put this question up on the screen, I think there's fundamentally the subtext of economic prosperity, and kind of, I think maybe to Kristen's point, like economic prosperity for who? Like who is on the receiving end of that? Who's the one building? Who is building the wealth in that context? And all of that being said, I think I am very aware of like kind of a counter narrative that is happening throughout our city that is, running counter to House Bill 2001 and how a lot of this plays out. And I think I just wanted to say, overall, I am in support of whatever really, whether it's incentivize or encourage on a number of these, whatever it takes to get, I think, the most people housed and kind of like, again, on that path to being able to build wealth how they want to build it. And I think at this point, any narrative that's occurring that is opposing kind of what the city is trying to do, and I think the point of these focus groups is frankly just obstructionist and like wealth hoarding, and I think we need to kind of start calling that what it is. So all of that being said, I would uplift pretty much everything that's already been said, and making sure we're thinking through, again, economic prosperity and for who, and like who's being protected through what we do and who's being kind of uplifted through what we do in those decisions. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you for being understanding of my queue mismanagement. And I have Kristen. You're muted.
Kelsey, that's right on. It's exactly what I was, Ibrahim, is that I mean, I say we just because I am in the profession of architecture and planning. I actually recognize I'm guilty. I need to question more. I need to understand the bias I go in, and what are the actions that we as a firm are going to put into place. So I think that you're exactly right, Kelsey. We are at a crossroads right now, and it's fascinating. We're not only at a crossroads in terms of the state. The state's taken a very bold step forward, and our community gets to be challenged. And I bought in, similar to Dan's story, as a graduate student, that my mortgage broker just happened to take a risk and give us a loan. And we happened to buy a house in the university neighborhood. I couldn't purchase again a house now in my own neighborhood, but I've been having these crucial conversations with my neighbors in Suna and Fairmount neighborhood about their terrified, what's going to happen when all these duplexes come up? What are they going to look like? What's the design going to be like? Are they going to be too close to my house? Are they going to And I have been challenging some of that is who does benefit from this? So as we go through the process, that's kind of the lens that I'm going to be trying to uncover. Where are my unconscious biases? Where are those biases? And Ibrahim called it, is that if we don't, the same gentrification, there's great examples. Aspen, Colorado was a tiny home of it was a tiny village. Everyone, I want to say everyone that originally my friend grew up there, nobody lives there anymore except for the wealthy. And we have urban growth boundaries. So what are we going to do to make sure that people can actually do what Ibrahim's dream is for his property? And how are we going to make that? Because our process is not only complicated, it's expensive. Even for a single family homeowner. I have a large lot. I've been waiting for this to happen because I want to divide it. I haven't been able to afford it because I would have had to do a PUD because of small lot standards, but I have a really big lot. So I have to do a bunch of things in order for me to build one more unit. And I actually have a stable job, so does my husband. I can't afford it. Now, what about someone that's just starting? That wants that duplex or that triplex in order to afford it? Dan's comment. So I'm excited to be part of it. And I know staff, you're kind of sitting there facilitating it. And this is a crossroads for our community. I do believe that. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. And I have Ibrahim followed by Julia.
Yeah, I want to say that this is one of the public meetings that I really feel like we're talking about something serious, and we all care about what we're talking about. For someone who's been on a lot of boards, you can say that most of the time people are not that concerned about the issue that I'm talking about. So I want to thank everybody in this panel. The second thing I want to say is, like Kristen touched on and Kelsey talked about, the main concern I have here is some single family house owners having to move out because of the property tax will increase with those multiplexes coming in the neighborhood. We're gonna see a raise on the property tax, but also a lot of pressure on those who cannot afford to build a second structure to remain in their house. And one of the things I believe we have here a lot about that during COVID-19, a lot of people are moving back in with their parents. They may have income, they may have a job, but they cannot afford to buy a house. So that's an opportunity for the family to be able to build something and in the back for a family member. So even without thinking about rentals, this is the opportunity for families to be able to not only remain together, having kids on the same lot with their parents. That's a great way, like we live in Africa, for kids to be able to take care of their parents and keep an eye on them. But the cost of doing so, as Kristen put it, it's unbelievable. You want to even build a driveway, you have to go get a permit somewhere, get insurance on those things. So the obstacle will be there. The only people who will be able to afford is going to be the developers that will come with money, and they'll start buying those single family houses and get people. Some people, I had a conversation yesterday with a couple who sold their house because they were afraid of that they don't have enough income, lost their job, but the housing market is such as they could make some money by selling their house and move into a rental. That's a sad story. They sold their house because they could make some money, and I don't see anytime soon when the prices will go down, even by allowing middle housing to pop up here and there. So I will go back again on making this affordable for people who have one house and are thinking about building a second structure.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And then I have Julia, followed by Dan Isaacson.
So I just wanted to comment briefly on kind of the communications issue that I think is an important part of this when you talk to people who are opposing, because I think that there's a strong narrative in Eugene that is about, I am imagining a Eugene that is small single family homes on giant lots that are affordable, and that is magic and that is perfect. And middle housing is a stressful alternative to this because it will encourage the developers. And so I oppose it. And I think that it's important, as Kristen pointed out about Aspen, or as I've seen as someone who at one horrible phase of my life lived in Bellevue, Washington, the alternative is not it stays the way it is, and somehow those houses that were built in 1956 don't actually need to be replaced because a lot of those houses can't really be saved. There are a lot of houses that will get rebuilt. But it seems like what we really need to think about is how to respond to the no camp by saying, but the alternative is developers come in and outprice you in order to build a McMansion. The alternative is not we stay the way we are and it's small and magically Kelsey can buy a house. The alternative is no one can buy a house because, well, no one on this conversation can buy a house because the old house gets torn down. And instead of being replaced by 4 we really wish these weren't $200,000 houses units, it gets replaced by 1, oh my God, it's $900,000 house. So if there's a way to, I don't know, the people who do communications no doubt have already thought about how to confront that particular form of opposition, but that, yeah. And I see many hands, so I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Julia. I have Dan Isaacson, followed by Kelsey.
So there's an old campaign saying that we campaign in poetry, govern in prose. And it's so true here. I mean, there's the Eugene that we all envision and a lot of people want to believe that they live in. And then there's the reality of what you actually live in, right? We want to believe that we're this utopian liberal paradise that really is inclusive and doesn't have a racial problem and doesn't have it's all not true. It's just not, right? So the sooner we stop having this fantasy and have a real conversation about what it is, where we want to go, where we are now. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's better than continuing in the fantasy world that we're in. And to get to the larger point, we're going to have a conversation with the county as well as the city, because I think there's a way to do this. Back to the first-time homebuyer tax credit, I got that tax credit with the promise that I couldn't sell the house for 5 years. So it couldn't be an economic engine for people to go buy a house, fix it up, add on a whole bunch of stuff, and then sell it off for a giant profit. It was designed specifically to foster investment by folks so that they can turn what is one property into potentially 2, or buy their own property for themselves, and to get them into being able to be a home buyer. And Commissioner Taylor, you talked about Aspen. That's totally true. My dad lives you talked about Aspen. My dad lives in Ashland. Bought a house when I was in high school. There's no way he could buy a house there. It is insane. I think there was 950,000 was the average price on his block. It's ridiculous, right? So if there was a program where we worked with the county to mitigate the surrounding areas property taxes so that they didn't boost up instantly because Ibrahim adds it in his duplex and all of a sudden I'm forced out because I can't pay my property taxes anymore, but he can't sell his property for a few years, so that we're ensuring that he's utilizing that program for his own benefit for exactly what the value is that we're instilling. Then we have that balance, but that's going to have to be part of that conversation of what do we actually want versus what we actually have.
Thank you. And I have Kelsey.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciated Julia's comments specifically. And yeah, I feel like something to that end that I've been asking myself or just kind of bringing to other meetings that I've been a part of is, I think it's just a fundamental question of, do you want to be avoiding change or do you want to be in relationship to it? Because ultimately the no change is not an option. Like the change is coming whether you like it or not. So it kind of is, and by you, I mean the broad you of that I think a lot of just like human migration and settlement patterns are going to change, right? And that's not something we can ultimately control, but it's something we can be in relationship to. And I say that as someone who has been in a number of meetings with just like the holiday farm fire stuff, and how many people, evacuees, people who lost their homes are living in Eugene, living in the Willamette Valley, because there's a whole bunch of restrictions with FEMA, right? Where people aren't able to rebuild expediently, or maybe aren't able to rebuild at all in Blue River or neighboring areas that got burnt out. And I was in a meeting with a number of neighbor people a while back where, you know, people were talking about being kind of up in arms with the House Bill 2001 stuff and kind of like, oh my God, what are we going to do in Eugene and blah, blah, blah. And at one point I jumped in and I was like, this is frankly disgusting that like we're talking about fighting House Bill 2001 and we just experienced a wildfire that had a huge influx of people that we're now having to be responsible for housing. And like y'all are sitting here talking about the ways that we need to fight missing middle or whatever, right? So I think that is just like going to be a contingent that is a part of this political landscape and how a lot of this moves forward. But ultimately I've been thinking about it as just like being in relationship to change, because again, like there are these like external climate factors that are going to continue to occur that are going to just change the landscape of Eugene anyway, and migration patterns. But I think it is the $1 million question of like, what do you say to those people? But I appreciate Julia's comments. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Kelsey. And in the queue, I have Kristen, followed by Dan Isaacson. You're muted.
Kristen,
again.
you're muted.
I debated sharing this, but I think I'm going to. So I have a situation where, or I have had a situation where, well, maybe I won't go into the details. So my experience working with my clients, which tend to be the 1%ers of our community, both more locally as well as regionally and outside of our state. So because we don't do single family, we do everything above. So a lot of multifamily, but I definitely will help them on some other issues. Like they will call me and talk about House Bill 2001. And I have very kind of candid discussions with them that kind of cross between that appropriate conversation, like Julia's saying, just let's break it down. Let's talk about what the reality is, blah, blah, blah. And also, you've got to be kidding me. Here's the perspective. Here's what's going on outside of your little lot. So know that money can always create a solution. So I know someone that is concerned about House Bill 2001, who's just going, in the end, they're going to potentially appeal a bunch of applications that are currently getting ready for properties to be subdivided and future development to be adjacent. They can either hold it up and appeal it all the way through, so obstruct the process. Now imagine that you're Ibrahim and somebody's going to obstruct the process. Or guess what they can do? They can just purchase the next door neighbor property. So let's say subdivision PUD goes through, they'll just purchase the property. So people with those that have money and means will find solutions to buffer themselves. So I think we can stop as planners and designers systemically including buffers there that facilitate the wealthy getting wealthier. So that's why I say this is going to be a crucial conversation, and Dan Isaacson has nailed it. And that's really my experience with Eugene. And it's why I gave the example about that keynote speaker that came in to talk about sustainable building in Eugene. We love to talk about it, but in reality, what are we really doing to incentivize or enforce it? It's growing. I mean, we're talking about, this was years ago in the 90s when, so it kind of that actually is applicable for housing right now. So I guess that's, I think I don't know. I look forward to the conversations about tools because I think it gets complicated. And one of the things, who was the keynotes? Who was the speaker that came in to talk about from Asheville? Terry. Anyways, going back and thinking about that broader perspective.
Joe Minicozy.
Joe, love Joe. So what can we do at this point? Is there anything we can do to, from a planning perspective, to earmark potentially property, going back to, okay, if some of our values and concerns are open space, parking, have the city, just like the West Eugene wetlands, we did a phenomenal job as a community creating a riparian ecological corridor. Why don't we do that for open space so that density can happen? Why don't we do it for parking structures, not just in downtown? Why don't we anticipate the growth with some infrastructure? And that's essentially the example of Paris. Now, I'd love to see Paris actually have a little bit more greenery in some of their open space, but Parisian design, the French design versus it does have some aesthetic, yet they're giant open spaces. So what can we do as a community that addresses what people are doing as rugged individualists on their own parcel? How can we make it more of something they can feel comfortable with if density was to occur?
Thank you, Kristen. And I have Julia in the queue.
I just wanted to add, I was thinking of the power of Commissioner Isaacson's Paris equals Eugene, and I'm thinking of another detail that might be valuable in these conversations. So I'm on the Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee. And one of the interesting features of this entity is that a few years ago, they still had a program to help first-time home buyers. It was some kind of, loan or grant for first-time home buyers. And they had for Eugene and Springfield. And both Eugene and Springfield had to abandon their programs because there were no single-family homes that met HUD standards in the affordable price range. And that's such an important visual because that's making the point that the fantasy world of the starter house for the starter family in Eugene is disappearing, and in part because of the strength of the housing stock and the age of the housing stock. And so it's one of those moments that reinforces the point that Kelsey was making. It's not about whether change will happen, but whether we participate in the change and we are part of the change and we shape the change, or whether it just happens because, as Kristen pointed out, someone can come in and buy that and property already and put a giant house on it. So, we're not able to stop that, but we might be able to shape it by creating this middle housing process in a way that is accessible. So.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everybody for this rich discussion. I echo Ibrahim. This group clearly is so committed to the community, and it's just a pleasure to staff this. So with this, I will wrap up the discussion. Terry and I are always available for questions and more comments. We love to talk to people about planning. It's what we do. Now Terry is going to talk about where we are in the project phase. And even though I said we would only have 2 meetings, there's a sale going on and we have a buy 2, get 1 free deal for you all that she'll go more into. So with that, I'll share my screen again and we'll get right to it.
Thank you, Sophie. While that's coming up, I'll just echo my thanks. It's such a pleasure to have you all in this discussion. You've brought up, again, a number of themes that we've been hearing from our Equity Roundtable, from our Healthy Democracy panel, and now for the 3rd time from you. So just a couple quick examples. When you're talking about who's uplifted and who benefits, that's a central theme of the Equity Roundtable we've been hearing from. And when Ibrahim brought up expanding public transportation, that is an idea that came up in several of the small groups of Healthy Democracy. And so it's just really cool to see the overlap and ideas coming out of different groups that all come from these values that we worked on over the fall with you all. You can go to the next slide. Great, this is hard to read, I apologize. I can send it out to you if you'd like to see it. Dan and Kristen will see it at their next Planning Commission meeting and probably already have seen it. But this is a graphic that started with our consultants, and then I put stuff on top of it because I liked how it kind of laid out real cleanly where we are in the process of developing middle housing code. So we are in the very end of February. Thank you for putting that line there, Sophie. And if you look down to task 5, it says healthy democracy, but that this is a visual that is encapsulating kind of 3 main phases of research. So back in November, December, we had this group, all of the roundtables and the healthy democracy panel were brought together in the fall, and then now in February, and potentially again in April. So what we'll be doing with the groups that do meet in April is looking at the code that is developed based on all of this input to this point. We'll have draft code at that point to look at. And we're hoping, because there's so much interest in it, in having discussions about further affordability strategies and tools, and a deeper affordability, if you will. This is a term that has been discussed quite a lot recently to describe affordability that reaches down deeper to the 40 to 60% of area median income levels. So if that is of interest to you all, we are in the process of setting up some developer focus groups, but also potentially some additional guest speakers and people who are working in the field of deep affordability strategies. And we could bring them to this group. Now, the kind of 2-for-1 sale that Sophie was talking about is an idea to put you together with another one of our roundtables. So this is a super fresh idea, like a couple hours ago. I thought that it might be something we could run by you, because the other roundtable that's made up of kind of stakeholder groups is called the Local Partners Roundtable. And they're meeting this coming Monday. And they include Chamber of Commerce, the Home Builders Association, Better Housing Together, neighborhood associations. And so a big variety of different stakeholders that are interested in this work. So I guess that's, I can't do a poll like on the fly, but it's something, Commissioner Isaacson has it come up. It's something I thought I'd put out for you all to consider. And I'll finish talking about this slide, and then we can take the slide down so we can all see each other a little bit better. Let me just check my notes. Well, I guess the other thing has already been said, and that is that we're in a phase of gathering public input. We have a survey out. It's in English and Spanish. We have the meetings in a box like Sophie talked about. So we're really trying to get as many responses as possible from groups like this and from the online survey that's available to everyone, so that we can make an informed recommendation as staff on how to write the code. Where to propose allow, if any, where to propose encourage, and where to propose incentivize. And that's kind of our next big task. All right, I think that's it. I don't even know if I have another slide. Sophie, so thank you. You can take that down. And I'll just ask for your questions and comments about that, and just offer it up for discussion about, do you want to meet again? And yes or no, or by email, kind of a couple of different options. And then what's your level of interest in combining groups to allow for some cross-pollination of the discussion?
See Dan Isaacson in the queue.
So 2 quick things. I'm all for meetings as long as they're productive and the participants are engaged as this group is. And two, I have to go. There was a family emergency that just popped up, so I have to hop off like right now. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much, but please include me on the next meeting. Thank you.
Okay.
And Kristen. You're muted.
I must not hit it strong enough, so I've got to do it anyways. I would love to. And I think the commingling groups, I think it's great. I think it's a great idea.
Kelsey.
I would echo that. I would say I also agree with Dan's comment that I'm all for being on meetings where I can be useful if it feels like that's helpful to the conversation. So please feel free to kind of keep me in the loop as things are moving forward. And I appreciate how productive these meetings have felt. So thank you for your facilitation as well.
Thanks, Kelsey. Ibrahim.
Yeah, I would say that I'm willing to meet with the other group, but we have to think about the size. Because sometimes if you have 20, 30 people, it's, you know, the meeting end up being a small group of people, or people who hands up can talk. This group works well because we can communicate.
Thank you. Yes, I have the local partners. It's slightly bigger than you all. There's 8 of them, if that helps.
That still puts us at about 15. We've been working with the Healthy Democracy Panel, which has 29, and they often do breakout groups. And so we just have to think about how to have productive conversations. This is kind of, I would say, a really good size for a conversation. So if we had groups that were about this size, that might be one way to do it.
Thanks, Terry. And Dan Lombardi. Or I guess I can just call you Dan now. You're the only one.
Yeah, I'm the only Dan. Yeah, I think I'll just echo what folks said. I'm happy to continue to meet with this group if it's necessary. It's been eye-opening. It's beautiful to be. I think I'll echo that comment of stuff that's getting done and good conversation is being had. So I appreciate that. And you know, I think anytime we can sort of get a varied perspective into this group too by expanding it a little bit, that shouldn't hurt, right? Maybe be challenged a little bit. I feel like I get challenged every time I've met with this group, and that's really important for me to grow. And so I think we can grow as a group too, and bring our perspective and sort of commingle it. So,
Dan, is that a banjo behind you?
It is, yes. I'm not going to play it for you though. So.
And Julia, did you have any thoughts? I hate to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm not, if it's a meeting on Monday, I'm not positive that I can attend. I think it would be valuable to do the cross-pollination, especially, how can I say this? If moderated the way that you have moderated these, it's really a model of moderation, allowing each person to speak and having that be part of the process. I have been on other city, in other city committees that don't work as well. So I'm slightly, there's a part of me that is slightly concerned that the experience of talking to the Chamber of Commerce and developers would be comparable to speaking the renter perspective to landlords in the Renter Protections Committee. And that has not been a pleasant experience in my life, but would have been better if moderated as you've done it today, Sophie. So I would try to join if available, but if you don't want everyone, you can drop me out and I won't be offended.
Thank you so much for that feedback. And I will clarify. So we're meeting on Monday with the local partners, but we're doing this exact same meeting all over again. So you won't want to go to that. This would be scheduled for April.
Oh, farther out. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And I would be interested in April.
Great. Thank you. You all are welcome to watch Monday if you want to go through it all over again, if you just had so much fun. Great. So this is just great news that you all would like to explore this further. And I will be in contact over email with what that looks like and when it's happening. Terry, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think it'll be very fruitful to combine those two groups. And And they have functioned in almost exactly the same way. So I'm not worried too much about it being an unproductive or disrespectful meeting. I think it'll be good.
Great, thank you. Well, we have 6 minutes to spare. The last thing I'll do is plug the survey. It closes next Friday, the 5th. Please tell everybody you know, and especially now, if you haven't already taken the survey, you know how it's structured and the types of questions we're asking, and hope to see your response. And thank you for a lovely conversation tonight.
Thanks for all the inspiration, musical and otherwise. I'm gonna go listen to some Prince, Julia.
Go listen to